There is a restaurant in your city that your mother talked about. The fried chicken was described by name. You were told who ran the kitchen. She told you the table she sat at the first time her mother took her. She told you what the plate cost, and what it tasted like, and who was sitting beside her, and what year it was. And one day the building was gone. The highway went through it. The neighborhood changed. The owner died, and nobody carried it forward. The sign came down, and the windows went dark, and the food that fed a community for 40 years disappeared from the street the way a voice disappears from a room when the person who spoke it leaves. This video is 25 of those restaurants. Number 22 is the restaurant where Martin Luther King planned the movement over a bowl of gumbo. Number 7 is the restaurant that was burned to the ground along with an entire black business district. And number 1 is not a restaurant at all. Hit that subscribe button. Here are 25 forgotten black-owned restaurants that changed America, and most of them no longer exist. Number 25. Wells Supper Club, Harlem, New York. In the late 1930s, a plate of fried chicken and waffles arrived at a table in a Harlem restaurant at 2 in the morning. The customer was a jazz musician who had just come off a gig at the Savoy Ballroom and wanted something between dinner and breakfast because the hour belonged to neither. Ann and Joseph Wells are widely credited with turning that combination into a signature dish that musicians, entertainers, and Harlem nightlife regulars ate for the next 6 decades. The chicken was fried to order. The waffles were made fresh. The combination of savory and sweet at an hour when most kitchens were closed made Wells the restaurant where Harlem went to eat after the show. By the end of the century, the restaurant had declined and eventually closed. The dish it popularized outlived the building by decades, served at brunch menus across America at $20 a plate. By restaurants that have never heard of Wells. The original location served celebrities, politicians, and neighborhood regulars at the same counter, and the waitresses knew who wanted extra syrup and who wanted the chicken leg instead of the breast without being told. When the building went dark, the neighborhood lost the kitchen that had been feeding it for 60 years. The dish that survived in restaurants across the country carries no memory of the woman who first put the chicken beside the waffle for a tired musician who just needed to eat. Ann Wells understood something about feeding people at 2 in the morning that most restaurants have never learned. The hour changes what the customer needs. At noon, you want a meal. At 2 in the morning, you want comfort, and the combination of fried chicken and warm waffles with syrup delivered comfort in a way that neither dish could deliver alone. Number 24. Paschal's, Atlanta. In the late 1940s, James and Robert Paschal opened a restaurant on Hunter Street in Atlanta that served fried chicken so respected that the restaurant became the place where civil rights organizers gathered to plan, argue, and eat. The Paschals bailed arrested protesters out of jail with money earned from the restaurant. They fed organizers who could not afford to eat. The dining room became an unofficial headquarters for the movement during the years when Atlanta was one of the centers of the fight. The original Hunter Street location eventually closed and the restaurant relocated, reduced in scope and separated from the street that gave it meaning. The fried chicken recipe survived the move. The history of the building did not. The original Paschals had a motor hotel attached, where visiting organizers slept because the white hotels in Atlanta would not accept them. The restaurant fed the movement and the hotel housed it, and together they formed one of the most important institutions in the civil rights infrastructure of the American South. When the building was lost, the city lost more than a restaurant. It lost the room where the strategy was made. A civil rights organizer who ate at Paschal's in the early 1960s said the fried chicken was the reason people came through the door, and the conversation at the table was the reason they stayed. The food created the occasion. The occasion created the movement. Remove the food, and the occasion does not happen. And the woman in the kitchen who fried the chicken understood that her job was not just feeding people. Her job was keeping the room full long enough for the work to get done. If those 2 entries told you something you did not know, The ones ahead are where the food and the movement become impossible to separate. Number 23. The Big Apple Inn, Jackson, Mississippi. A pig ear sandwich cost 15 cents. A smoked sausage sandwich cost a quarter. The restaurant had been serving both since 1939 from a small counter on Farish Street in Jackson's Black Business District. Upstairs, Medgar Evers ran the local NAACP office. The food economy of the Big Apple Inn was directly underwriting the civil rights movement because every sandwich sold downstairs kept the lights on in the building where the organizing happened upstairs. The restaurant survived Evers's assassination, survived the decline of Farish Street, and continued serving pig ear sandwiches from the same counter for decades after most of the businesses around it had closed. The sandwich cost almost nothing. The building it sustained was priceless. The pig ear sandwich at the Big Apple Inn is still served today at a price that is still low from a counter that is still small. The history of what happened upstairs is part of every sandwich that crosses that counter, even if the person eating it has never heard the name Medgar Evers. The food carries the history whether the customer knows it or not. Number 22. Dooky Chase's, New Orleans, a bowl of gumbo's herbs with 7 greens and a plate of fried chicken at a table in the upstairs dining room where Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, and Freedom Riders planned strategy for the movement in the South. Leah Chase ran the kitchen for more than 60 years and built a Creole institution that served the best food in New Orleans to the people who were fighting for the right to eat in every other restaurant in the city. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina flooded the building. The water destroyed the kitchen, the dining room, and decades of history. She rebuilt. She reopened in 2007 at the age of 83 and cooked until she was 96. The restaurant survived the hurricane. It survived segregation. It survived everything the city threw at it because the woman in the kitchen refused to let it close. Chase said the water took everything but the recipes, and the recipes were in her head, and the water could not reach her head. The woman was famous for 2 rules in her dining room. You did not put hot sauce on her gumbo before tasting it, and you did not discuss business until after the first course was served. Both rules applied to everyone from neighborhood regulars to sitting presidents. The gumbo arrived at the table seasoned the way she intended it, and the conversation waited until the food had established the mood. A woman who had survived segregation, a hurricane, and 80 years of cooking was not going to let a bottle of hot sauce overrule her kitchen. She rebuilt the kitchen from memory, the way the women on this list have always rebuilt their kitchens, by remembering what the food was supposed to taste like and refusing to serve anything less. Number 21. The 4-Way, Memphis. Martin Luther King's favorite restaurant in Memphis, a small establishment near Soulsville and Stax Records that served fried chicken, turnip greens, cornbread, and sweet potato pie to a room that was one of the city's first effectively integrated dining spaces. King ate at the 4-Way when he came to Memphis to support the sanitation workers' strike in 1968. The restaurant closed for years after the neighborhood declined. A community revival brought it back, but the years between the closing and the reopening were years when the building sat empty and the history inside it came close to being lost permanently. The food that King ate at that counter almost disappeared from the street because the neighborhood that sustained it was allowed to hollow out. The revival of the 4-Way proved that the food and the history were strong enough to bring people back. But the years of emptiness proved something more important. A Black-owned restaurant in a declining neighborhood does not close because the food fails. It closes because the neighborhood around it is allowed to fail. The businesses leave first. The families follow. The church relocates. Then the restaurant is the last occupied building on a block that used to be full, and the cook is serving food to a street that no longer has the foot traffic to sustain her. The food is still excellent. The dining room is half empty. The restaurant closes not because it failed, but because it was the last thing standing. Number 20. Sylvia's Harlem. In 1962, Sylvia Woods borrowed money and bought a small luncheonette on Lenox Avenue. The menu was collard greens, fried chicken, mac and cheese, cornbread, candied yams, and ribs. The food was the food that every black grandmother made at home, served in a dining room that gave it an address and a reputation. A 1979 review brought national attention, and Sylvia's became the restaurant that defined soul food for mainstream America. Sylvia Woods did not invent the recipes. She made them permanent. The collard greens that grandmothers across Georgia and Mississippi cooked for their families were being cooked by Sylvia Woods for the city. The city lined up around the block because the food tasted like somebody's grandmother made it. It still does. Sylvia's survived because the woman who built it understood that a soul food restaurant is not selling food. It is selling the feeling of being fed by someone who knows you. The waitress who calls you baby and the plate that arrives without being ordered because she already knows what you want and the portion that is larger than it needs to be because generosity is the point. Sylvia Woods bottled that feeling and served it on Lenox Avenue for 5 decades. Number 19. Roscoe's House of Chicken and Waffles, Los Angeles. In 1975, Herb Hudson carried the combination that Wells Supper Club had built in Harlem across the country to Los Angeles. The restaurant became famous through Hollywood, serving the dish to entertainers, athletes, and working families at the same tables. Roscoe's proved that a dish born in a Harlem after-hours kitchen could travel 3,000 miles and become a cultural institution in a city that had no history with it. The chicken and waffles that a jazz musician ate at 2 in the morning in Harlem in the 1940s became the meal that Los Angeles ate at noon on a Sunday in the 1980s. The journey between those two tables is the journey of black food innovation across America. Herb Hudson understood that the dish did not need to stay in Harlem to survive. He carried it to a city where nobody had heard of it and trusted that the combination would speak for itself. The chicken was fried to order. The waffles were made fresh. The pairing that a Harlem supper club had created for jazz musicians at 2 in the morning became the Sunday afternoon tradition for families in South Central and Hollywood and every neighborhood in between. The restaurant proved that black food innovation does not need permission to travel. It just needs someone willing to carry it. Number 18. Nichols Drive-In, East St. Louis. Hickory smoked beef ribs, snoots, and pork served from a black-owned drive-in that exemplifies a tradition largely written out of mainstream barbecue history. The black-owned drive-in barbecue restaurant was a format that thrived across the Midwest and the South during the mid-20th century, serving smoked meat from a counter or a window to a community that could not eat at the white-owned restaurants across town. Nichols and the drive-ins like it built a barbecue tradition that the mainstream food industry eventually absorbed without crediting the people who created it. The ribs that America considers its own were perfected at counters that most food histories have never mentioned. The black-owned drive-in barbecue joint was as much an American institution as the white-owned roadhouse, but it served a community that could not eat at the roadhouse. The barbecue that came through the window was seasoned by the same hands and smoked over the same wood and tasted as good or better than anything served at the restaurants that would not seat the people who made it. A rib that came through a drive-in window at Nichols carried the same smoke and the same technique as a rib served at a white-owned barbecue restaurant across the river. But the rib at Nichols was served to a customer who could not eat at the other restaurant, and the customer knew the rib was better because the cook had been perfecting it for a community that depended on him. Number 16 is the restaurant that proved black women built the food economy of an entire neighborhood. Number 17. Southern Kitchen, St. Louis. A home-cooked meal refuge for black travelers and entertainers who were barred from white establishments during Jim Crow. Southern Kitchen belonged to a network of black-owned restaurants that existed because the law required them to. Black travelers could not eat at roadside diners. They could not stop at most restaurants between cities. The restaurants that served them were not restaurants of choice, they were restaurants of necessity. The women who ran them cooked with the same care they used at home because the traveler who walked through the door was tired and hungry and far from family. The plate that arrived at the table had to carry the weight of home. A musician who stopped at Southern Kitchen between gigs said the fried chicken tasted like the kitchen he had left in Mississippi 3 years earlier. The taste was so close to his mother's that he sat in the booth for an extra hour. The food had made him homesick and healed the homesickness at the same time. Number 16. The Venetian Tea Room, Harlem, opened in the 1920s by Susie Price and Iolanthe Sidney. The Venetian was part of an overlooked economy of black women-owned tea rooms that fed Harlem's night workers, artists, and neighborhood regulars. The tea rooms stayed open late because the women who ran them understood that Harlem's economy did not close at 5. The food was simple, the hours were long, the ownership was female. The tea room economy of Harlem in the 1920s was one of the earliest networks of black women-owned food businesses in American history. Almost none survived into the 1950s because the neighborhoods changed and the women who ran them were never given the capital to adapt. Susie Price and Iolanthe Sidney built the Venetian on the principle that black women deserved a dining room as refined as any tea room in Midtown Manhattan. The tablecloths were white. The service was formal. The food was prepared with a precision that signaled to every customer who walked through the door that this room took itself seriously and expected them to do the same. Number 15. The White Peacock, Harlem. Opened in 1922 by Douglas Howe, the White Peacock was a haven for Harlem Renaissance writers and artists that combined food with a library and murals. The restaurant was the literary side of the black food economy, a place where a meal came with conversation, and the dining room doubled as a cultural salon. Restaurants like the White Peacock existed because black intellectuals and artists could not sit in the dining rooms of white cultural institutions, and the food establishments they built in response were richer, warmer, and more alive than the rooms they were excluded from. The murals on the walls of the White Peacock depicted scenes from black life and history that no white-owned restaurant in New York would have displayed. The dining room was decorated with intention. Every image and every book on the library shelf chosen to create an atmosphere of intellectual pride that made the meal about more than the food. A writer who ate at the White Peacock said, the restaurant made him feel like his work mattered in a city that mostly told him it did not. Number 14. White's Drive-In, Longview, Texas. Opened in the early 1950s and paired with a Green Book Motel, White's served black travelers who could not eat or sleep at the white-owned establishments along the highway. The drive-in was one of the rare survivors that was eventually reopened by descendants of the original owners. The survival story is the exception that proves how rare it was for a black-owned restaurant from the segregation era to make it through the decades that followed. The descendants who reopened it understood that the building was not just a restaurant. It was evidence that their family had been in business in Longview, Texas for 70 years, and the building itself was the proof. Without the building, the history becomes a story. With the building, the history is a fact you can walk into. If you want to cook the recipes that came from these kitchens, the Grandma Made Away collection is in the description. Number 13. Big Mike's, Milwaukee. Mike Watley opened a drive-in in the 1960s that served the community until structural discrimination made survival impossible. Suppliers capped his credit at $100, while white-owned businesses in the same city ran credit lines in the thousands. The gap between what he was allowed to borrow and what his competitors were given meant he could never stock enough inventory to compete. The restaurant did not close because the food was bad or the customers stopped coming. It closed because the financial system that sustained every other restaurant in the city refused to sustain his. Watley was an activist who used his restaurant as a community gathering place, and the financial discrimination he faced was not accidental. The suppliers who capped his credit understood that a well-stocked black-owned restaurant in a black neighborhood was a source of economic independence, and economic independence was the one thing the system was designed to prevent. Number 12. Hammond Cafe, Abilene, Texas, a chili specialist and community hub in the rural western South, listed in the Green Book as a safe stop for black travelers crossing Texas. Restaurants like the Hammond Cafe existed in small towns across the South and the West, serving food to travelers who had no other option and serving community to neighborhoods that had no other gathering place. When the Green Book became unnecessary after the Civil Rights Act, the travelers who had sustained these restaurants gained access to every other restaurant on the highway. The new freedom drained the customer base that had kept places like the Hammond Cafe alive. Integration gave black diners a choice they had earned and deserved. But the choice emptied the rooms that necessity had filled. And the cook who had been feeding travelers for 20 years watched the dining room thin out not because the food changed, but because the world outside the door finally opened. Number 11. Black Beauty Tea Room, Mount Olive, North Carolina, a small-town Green Book institution that provided food, safety, and a place to sit down in a country that did not want you sitting at its tables. The difference was scale. Harlem's tea rooms served thousands. The Black Beauty served a town. The loss of the small-town Green Book restaurant is the quietest disappearance on this list because the towns they served were small enough that nobody outside the community noticed when the doors closed. A woman in Mount Olive who remembered the Black Beauty said the restaurant smelled like biscuits and coffee from the street. The smell was how you knew the doors were open because the sign was small and the building was easy to miss. When the smell stopped reaching the sidewalk, the neighborhood knew the restaurant was gone before the sign came down. Number 10. Odds and Ends, Harlem. One of the earliest Harlem tea rooms, women-owned and kept open at unusually long hours to serve the night economy of a neighborhood that never slept. The women who ran Odds and Ends understood that a restaurant's hours are a statement about who it serves. Keeping the doors open past midnight was a declaration that the night workers, the musicians, and the people on Harlem's schedule deserved a meal at the same hour the rest of the city was sleeping. The tea rooms of Harlem in the 1920s were the ancestors of every late-night soul food restaurant that exists today. The 24-hour diner, the after-hours kitchen, the restaurant that stays open because the community it serves does not keep bankers' hours. That tradition started with women like the owners of Odds and Ends, who kept the lights on and the stove hot because their customers needed a table at midnight and nobody else was offering one. Number 9. Bagley's, Sheepshead Bay, New York. Caroline Bagley's Garden Tea Room showed the breadth of the black food economy beyond soul food. Bagley's was fine dining, tea service, and garden atmosphere in a neighborhood where the assumption was that black-owned restaurants served one kind of food in one kind of room. The tea room proved that black culinary ambition extended far beyond the plate of fried chicken and greens that the mainstream food industry was willing to acknowledge. Caroline Bagley proved that a black woman could operate a fine dining establishment in a white neighborhood, and the quality transcended every assumption about who could run a tea room. Number 8. Aunt Dinah's Kitchen, Harlem. Run by Broadway actor Richard Huey, a Green Book-listed community institution that linked Harlem's theater world to its food economy. The restaurant fed actors, musicians, and working families from the same kitchen, and the Green Book listing meant that black travelers from outside the city knew they could eat there safely. Aunt Dinah's Kitchen existed at the intersection of performance and sustenance, a restaurant run by an artist who understood that both required the same discipline. Richard Huey cooked with the same attention to detail he brought to the stage. A well-prepared meal and a well-performed role both depend on timing, preparation, and the refusal to cut corners when the audience is watching. The entries ahead are where the story shifts from individual restaurants to the forces that destroyed them. Number 7. Busy Bee Cafe, Greenwood, Tulsa. part of the thriving food district in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street. In 1921, white mobs attacked Greenwood and burned it to the ground. The Busy Bee Cafe and every restaurant and business on the street were destroyed. The food economy that black families have built over decades was erased in a single night of violence. The Busy Bee is not a story about a restaurant that closed. It is a story about a restaurant that was taken. The distinction between closing and being taken is the distinction that runs through every entry from this point forward. Greenwood was rebuilt after the massacre, but the food economy that had sustained it was never fully restored. The restaurants that returned operated in the shadow of what had been lost, and the memory of what the white mobs destroyed was carried by the community for a century before the rest of the country acknowledged that the destruction had occurred. The Busy Bee Cafe is the entry on this list that carries the most weight per sentence because the restaurant did not close. It was destroyed by people who considered the community it fed expendable. Every other entry on this list involves economic forces or policy decisions or the slow erosion of a neighborhood. The neighborhood was not eroded, it was attacked. The distinction matters because the distinction is the difference between a tragedy and a crime. Number 6. The Great Migration Diners. Not one restaurant, but hundreds. When black families moved from the South to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and every northern city the railroad reached, the women who carried Southern cooking in their memory opened small restaurants and lunch counters that translated soul food for a new geography. The diner on the south side of Chicago that served smothered pork chops and greens and cornbread was a Mississippi kitchen rebuilt in a city that had never tasted it. Most of these diners lasted one generation. The woman who opened it ran it until she could not, and the diner closed when she did because the restaurant was the woman and the woman was the restaurant. A diner on 47th Street in Chicago that served smothered pork chops, turnip greens, and peach cobbler was run by a woman from Greenville, Mississippi, who had carried the recipes north in her head and opened a counter with a loan from her church. The diner fed the South Side for 22 years. When she retired, the diner closed within 6 months because nobody who applied to take over the kitchen could match the taste. The recipes were in her hands, not on paper, and her hands left when she did. Number 5. The Green Book Drive-In Network. More than 50 documented black-owned drive-ins, diners, and restaurants listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book across the South and the Midwest. The Green Book existed because black travelers could not stop at white-owned restaurants along the highway. The drive-ins that served them were lifelines, not luxuries. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Green Book became unnecessary. Black travelers could eat anywhere. The freedom was real and the freedom was earned, and the freedom emptied the restaurants that had existed because the freedom did not. Within a decade, most of the Green Book restaurants had closed. The law that liberated the customer destroyed the business that had sustained him. A Green Book drive-in in rural Alabama that had served fried fish and coleslaw to black travelers every Friday for 20 years closed in 1967. The owner said the highway still ran past his door, but the cars no longer stopped because the drivers could now stop anywhere. The freedom was a miracle. The empty parking lot was the cost. More than 50 documented black-owned restaurants, drive-ins, and diners that had fed travelers for decades closed within 10 years of desegregation. Each one represented a family that had built a business from nothing, served a community that had no other option, and lost the business when the option expanded. The Green Book restaurants were not casualties of failure. They were casualties of progress, and the progress was worth more than what it cost. But the cost should be remembered. Number 4. The Integration Paradox. Desegregation gave black diners access to white-owned restaurants for the first time. The choice was real and deserved and long overdue. The consequence was that the captive customer base that had sustained black-owned restaurants for decades was no longer captive, a black family in Atlanta in 1965 could eat at Paschal's or at the white-owned restaurant across town that had refused them the year before. Many chose the restaurant that had refused them because the choice itself was the victory. The black-owned restaurant that had fed them during the years when nobody else would lost the customers it had served, not because the food changed, but because the world did. The cruelest irony in the history of black food in America is that the freedom the movement fought for was partly won in black-owned restaurant dining rooms, and the freedom they won emptied those dining rooms. A black restaurant owner in Atlanta watched his dining room go from full to half full within 2 years of desegregation. The food had not changed, the service had not changed, the customers had gained the freedom to eat somewhere else. And many of them exercised that freedom because the ability to sit at a counter that had refused them was worth more than loyalty to the counter that had always welcomed them. The integration paradox is the wound at the center of this list. Every restaurant from number 25 to number 6 existed because segregation forced black communities to build their own food economy. The economy they built was extraordinary. The restaurants were gathering places, movement headquarters, cultural institutions, and family dining rooms all at once. When the walls came down, the economy that those walls had created came down with them. The restaurants did not die of failure. They died of freedom, and the freedom was worth it. But the loss was real. Number 3, the highways and urban renewal. In the 1950s and 60s, interstate highway construction and urban renewal projects were routed through black business districts across the country by eminent domain. The buildings were demolished, the restaurants leveled, the communities scattered. This was not a market force, but a policy decision. The highway that cut through a black neighborhood was not an accident of engineering. It was a choice made by planners who considered the neighborhood expendable. And the restaurants that had fed those neighborhoods for decades were buried under concrete, along with the barbershops and the churches and the homes. In city after city, the interstate went through the black business district instead of around it because the black business district had no political power to redirect the route. The National Park Service has documented the destruction. The evidence is not disputed. The highways that cut through Overtown in Miami, through Haiti in Durham, through Black Bottom in Detroit, through Bronzeville in Chicago, were routed through black neighborhoods by planners who value the land beneath black businesses, more than the businesses themselves. The food traditions that have been built in those buildings did not survive the demolition because the traditions needed the buildings and the buildings needed the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was taken. Number 2, Ollie's Barbecue, Birmingham. This entry is not a black-owned restaurant. Ollie's was a white-owned barbecue joint that sued all the way to the Supreme Court for the right to refuse service to black customers. The case, Katzenbach versus McClung in 1964, tested whether the Civil Rights Act could force a restaurant to serve black diners. The owners argued that the federal government had no authority over a local restaurant. The Supreme Court disagreed. That restaurant is on this list because it represents exactly what every black-owned restaurant on this list existed in opposition to. Every pig ear sandwich at the Big Apple Inn, every bowl of gumbo at Dooky Chase's, every plate of fried chicken at Paschal's existed because Ollie's Barbecue and thousands of restaurants like it would not serve the people who needed to eat. The Supreme Court ruled against Ollie's because the restaurant purchased meat that had crossed state lines, which brought it under federal commerce jurisdiction. A white-owned barbecue restaurant in Birmingham was forced to serve black customers because the beef on its grill came from a cow in another state. The law won, the principle won, and the black-owned restaurants that had existed because of restaurants like Ollie's began losing the customers whose only option they had been. The black-owned restaurant was not a choice. It was an answer to a door that was closed in their face. And if you want to carry any of these recipes forward, the Grandma Made Away collection is in the description. Number 1, the kitchen table. There is no restaurant at number 1 because the most important black-owned dining room in America was never a business. It was the kitchen table where a grandmother fed her family before any restaurant on this list existed, and after most of them closed. Every restaurant, from number 25 to number 2, was trying to recreate what that table provided. A place where the food was made with care, where the person eating it was known by name, and where the meal carried the weight of a family still together. The supper club served chicken and waffles at 2 in the morning because the musicians needed a table. Paschal's served fried chicken to organizers because the movement needed a table. Dooky Chase's served gumbo to freedom riders because the fight needed a table. The table was always the point. The restaurant was just the building around it. The building could be taken by a highway or emptied by integration or burned to the ground. But the table survived because the table was wherever the grandmother sat down, the food was whatever she decided to cook, and the restaurant was her kitchen. And it never closed. Wells closed, Paschal's relocated, the four-way sat empty for years, the Green Book network vanished, the highways buried the dining rooms, integration emptied the seats. But the grandmother's table survived all of it because the grandmother's table was never a business. It was a promise that the family would eat together. The promise was kept every night in a kitchen that no highway could reach and no law could empty and no fire could burn. The kitchen was the woman. The woman was the food. Neither of them ever stopped. Every restaurant on this list was built by someone who learned to cook at a kitchen table before they ever stood behind a counter. Ann Wells learned at a table, Paschal learned at a table, Leah Chase learned at a table, and Sylvia Woods learned at a table. The table came first, and the restaurant came second. And when the restaurant closed, the table was still there, still set, still carrying the food that the building had tried to preserve. Drop the restaurant your family remembers in the comments. The one your mother described by name, the table she sat at, the plate she ordered, the year the building disappeared. Because every restaurant on this list was built by someone who understood that a plate of food at a table where you are welcome is not a meal. It is a declaration that you exist and you matter and you deserve to sit down. The restaurant your mother remembered is on this list, or it is a restaurant exactly like one on this list. A small building on a street that changed. A kitchen run by a woman or a man who cooked because the community needed feeding and nobody else was going to do it. A dining room that was full every Saturday night and empty by Tuesday and full again by Friday because the neighborhood kept coming back. That restaurant is gone now. The building might still be standing, but the sign is down and the kitchen is cold, and the woman who ran it is remembered only by the people who ate her food. This video is for her.